Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at how drugs became illegal in the first place and why some stay illegal even when the science doesn't quite back it up anymore. Our goals today, we're going to better understand what the Controlled Substances Act, or CSA, is and how it classifies drugs in the United States. We're going to examine the criteria that is used for scheduling and how those criteria are inconsistently applied. We're going to explore how politics and public fear influence scheduling decisions more than pharmacology does. And we're going to reflect on what happens when drug classifications outlast their evidence base. By the end of today, you should at least be able to explain how the federal government defines controlled substances and the critique of the process for doing so. To understand the Controlled Substances Act, we need to start with why it was created. And the truth is, the war on drugs didn't begin with concern for public health. It began with political strategy. President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one in 1971 and launched what became known as the war on drugs. But behind the tough on crime rhetoric was a much more targeted agenda. In a 1994 interview, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, admitted, quote, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or to be black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, end quote. What followed was a deliberate use of drug policy to increase police surveillance and arrests in specific communities, to discredit anti-war activists and civil rights leaders, and to justify harsher sentencing laws for drug crimes. The strategy culminated in the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which gave the federal government sweeping power to criminalize substances, and, by extension, to criminalize entire populations under the guise of public safety. So when we talk about the Controlled Substances Act, we're not just talking about pharmacology or medical risk. We're talking about a tool of public control that is politically dressed up as public policy. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was passed as part of the larger Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of the same year. It created a framework for regulating and criminalizing drugs based on a 5-tier scheduling system. These schedules determine, first, a drug's legal status, second, if there's any medical use at all, third, its potential for abuse, and fourth, the severity of punishment for unauthorized possession or sale of said substance. Basically, the higher the schedule number, the lower the perceived risk. Here's a quick breakdown for you. Schedule 1s have no accepted medical use and have a high potential for abuse, meaning heroin, LSD, ecstasy, and marijuana currently. In our Schedule 2 groups, we have a high potential for abuse still, but there is some accepted medical value, meaning cocaine, meth, and oxycodone. In Schedules 3 through 5, we have increasing medical use and decreasing abuse potential. In these groups, you'll find things like anabolic steroids, Xanax, Ambien, cough syrup with codeine, and the list continues. So far, this sounds technical and evidence-based, but in practice, it gets messy really fast. Let's look at a few glaring contradictions in how drugs are scheduled. Marijuana is still classified as a Schedule 1 under federal law, right there next to heroin. This means the federal government officially considers it to have a high potential for abuse, no medically accepted value, and is not safe under medical supervision. Meanwhile, drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine are listed as Schedule 2, meaning that they're seen as being less dangerous in nature and medically useful. But wait, how is that even possible? Marijuana is legal in over half of the United States for medicinal or recreational use. It has documented therapeutic benefits for pain, nausea, epilepsy, and many more treatments. Furthermore, no one has ever died of a marijuana overdose. So why hasn't it been rescheduled then? because the scheduling process isn't purely scientific, it's political in nature. The Attorney General through the DEA has the final authority over scheduling decisions. The FDA provides input, but it's not binding. And Congress can also pass legislation that directly schedules or reschedules a substance, often in response to media, political pressure, or public fear over that substance. Let's go ahead and walk through a few examples that highlight how much public narrative drives classification. First, let's turn to the examples of LSD and ecstasy, or MDMA. Both were originally used in psychotherapy settings and showed promising results. But after a surge in recreational use and media-fueled panic in the 1970s and 80s, they were both moved to Schedule I, cutting off research for decades. Not only was LSD commonly associated with counterculture drug use, but it was also commonly associated with Dr. Timothy Leary, who was considered public enemy number one for Nixon as a person. He hated Leary with a passion and viewed him as the leader of the counterculture movement. Crack and powder cocaine. Let's talk about these two for a second. Both forms are chemically identical, but crack became associated with lower-income urban black communities, while powder was often seen as the club drug or a yuppie vice. While not formally scheduled differently, the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity created the same effect. Far harsher punishment for crack than for powder. In 1989, we saw President George H.W. Bush famously hold up a bag of crack cocaine that was purchased from an undercover officer, through entrapment, mind you, but literally right across the street from the White House. That narrative drove the threat of the crack fiends. They're found everywhere, even near government buildings. As we move towards more synthetic drugs, we see new psychoactive substances that are emerging, like bath salts or designer fentanyl, that are often scheduled preemptively, even if little is known about their risk. This ban first, study later approach reflects panic-driven policy, not precautionary science. But as the opioid crisis continues, I am sure we will keep preemptively scheduling other synthetics that come through. So why should we care at all how drugs are scheduled? Because scheduling affects so much. It affects medical research. It's much harder to study Schedule I drugs, even when they show therapeutic promise, just from the scheduling alone. Funding and enforcement priorities are also affected. Schedule I drugs often receive the most from enforcement attention. Public perception. Classification influences how we talk about drugs in school, the media, and in healthcare settings. Criminal consequences are also impacted. The higher the schedule, the harsher the penalties. It's also very difficult to reverse scheduling decisions. Once a drug is labeled dangerous and without medical use, it becomes politically risky for any agency to change its classification, even many decades later. This can result in outdated laws that no longer reflect public health realities, scientific consensus, or state policy. So let's take a closer look at the ongoing debate around the rescheduling process of marijuana, which currently remains a Schedule I substance under federal law, despite its widespread medical and recreational use in U.S. states. So here's what's important to know. How rescheduling works. There are two pathways to reschedule a substance. The first is through administrative petition, in which a drug is submitted to the DEA and in which somebody consults with the FDA for a scientific and medical reevaluation. Secondly, congressional action. Congress can pass legislation to reclassify or deschedule a drug entirely. But the DEA historically has rejected petitions to reclassify marijuana, citing the, quote, lack of accepted medical value at the federal level, insufficient large-scale clinical trials, which of course don't exist because it is a Schedule I drug, and concern over abuse potential, even when those claims contradict state data and scientific research. Let's talk about a history of blocked efforts. Dating all the way back to 1972, the first petition was filed to reschedule marijuana. It wasn't resolved until 1988 when an administrative judge actually recommended reclassification, only for the DEA to overrule him. In 2001 and 2011, additional petitions were denied. In 2016, the DEA once again refused to reschedule, citing lack of FDA-approved medical use, even though 30-plus states had legalized medicinal marijuana by then. So what's happening now? In 2023, the Department of Health and Human Services formally recommended a rescheduling of marijuana to a Schedule III drug. This would recognize its medicinal use. It would lower federal penalties surrounding these convictions, and would also allow researchers and businesses to operate with fewer restrictions. The DEA is currently reviewing this recommendation, but it is not guaranteed. Even with political pressure, the process is slow, bureaucratic, and highly politicized. So why does it matter? Until marijuana is rescheduled or descheduled altogether, it remains illegal under federal law. Businesses can't access federal banking structures, research is limited, and people can still be prosecuted under federal statutes, especially in states without legalization. This is a perfect example of how drug policy can fall decades behind science and public opinion, and how much of the gatekeeping still exists in the name of control. So let's review. The Controlled Substances Act created a federal hierarchy of drugs, but its application is often inconsistent and shaped by fear and politics. Schedule I status has been applied to substances like marijuana and MDMA for decades, despite growing evidence of medical use and low harm. Meanwhile, more dangerous substances like meth and cocaine remain in Schedule II due to medical technicalities and historical inertia. Rescheduling is a rare and often slow process, and lags behind both science and public opinion. As we move forward in the course, we'll revisit how these classifications shape public policy, punishment, and public health initiatives. Next week, we're going to begin examining the criminal justice system's role in enforcing these classifications, starting with who gets stopped, arrested, and charged in America's war on drugs. Thank you for being here with me this week, and I'll see you all next time.